This video covers Module 2 Part B, Observational Research. In this video I'll talk about observation as a research method, and rather than going through the full spectrum of techniques that are available to us, what I'll do is talk about the different ways in which we can classify some of the observational techniques. And this becomes really interesting and really quite informative because we can start to see the real versatility of this research approach. We'll talk a little bit about ethics of observation, because if we're observing people, and often in naturalistic environments, then obviously there are ethical considerations we need to take into account. And we'll talk about a special group of techniques called physiological observation techniques that really look at the way people's bodies behave, or people behave physiologically rather than the way that they act within the wider environment. So it's quite an informative group of techniques. So what is observation? As a research technique, we talk about it being the systematic process of recording behavioral patterns across time. Now, historically, that description may have said recording behavioral patterns as they occur, but as you'll see as we go through the content in the lecture today, it's not always the case that we're looking at the actual behaviors. Sometimes we're looking at the artifacts left behind that indicate the behavior has taken place. So that also constitutes observational research. So let's break that definition down a little bit. To start off with, we say that it's a systematic process, and this will crop up when we talk about any of the research techniques in this course, because when we're conducting research, we really have to be methodical and employ a rigorous approach to what we're doing. That ensures we follow the correct procedure and do the right thing, but it also means that other people can come in, know what we've done, critique what we've done, and potentially replicate what we've done to check the credibility and generalizability of our findings and our conclusions. So it's the systematic process of recording behavioral patterns. So we're not just interested necessarily in one-off instances of behaviors, we're interested in these patterns of behaviors. We're not interested in people's anecdotes of a behavior that occurred, we're interested in observing the sequence of behaviors that occurred and things that might have affected those. It can be both qualitative and quantitative, depending on the research question that you have and the approach that you employ. So you can think about this scene depicted here on the screen, which is clearly in a retail context with people lining up at a checkout. A qualitative researcher might go into that setting and they might be interested in people's reactions when lining up, or the way in which they interact with each other. Do people appear agitated or frustrated? Do people appear to be guarding their personal space? What do they do while they're waiting? Those sorts of questions. A quantitative researcher might instead go into that setting and say, well, is there a difference between the number of items that people are taking through a conventional checkout versus a self-serve checkout while they're waiting in a queue? How long does the queue have to be before people move on to a different line? Those sorts of things. Really looking to quantify aspects of those settings. When we're talking about observational research, we're really saying that it contrasts with some of those other techniques like your qualitative interviews or something like a survey, where we go out and we ask people about how they behave or how they might intend to behave in the future. With observation, we're not asking them how they behave, we're actually observing their behavior. So it becomes a lot more real in that sense. And the benefit of doing that is it doesn't rely on people to be able to articulate what they've done in the past or what they want to do in the future, and it doesn't rely on them having an awareness of what they've done or that level of insight into what's occurred in the past. We actually observe their true behavior. So you can think about for yourself why this would be useful. If you think about a question like how many people have you interacted with online within the last week, if that's not something that you've consciously monitored or ever thought about, then that can be quite difficult for you to give an accurate response to. With observation, we might set up a design where we measure or in some way observe how many people you interact with, so we get a more valid estimate or a more reliable estimate of the exact number of people. In addition, if we're observing people, particularly if it's in a naturalistic setting where they're not too concerned about being observed or perhaps don't know that they're being observed, then people are going to behave more naturally, more authentically, and they're not going to be influenced by the presence of the researcher. So think about a qualitative interview where someone might be a little bit guarded in their responses. the fact that they're talking to a researcher might influence the type of data that they give. With observational research, we really avoid that. It gets at this idea or this concept of social desirability bias. Social desirability bias is where participants in a research setting will often present themselves or give responses to researchers in a way that paints them in a positive light or paints them in a socially desirable manner. So when we're observing them instead, we get around some of those issues with social desirability bias. Good example of where that would come into play is listed here on the screen, where you might have a research question such as this one: how do people respond when approached by a charity worker in the street? And if you were to ask that question as part of an interview, you might get people saying, well, it really depends on the charity that they're representing. Sometimes I'll listen to them, sometimes I won't, sometimes I'm quite friendly, and other times I'll move on if I'm in a hurry. We know in reality, though, if we conduct observational research, that the vast majority of people aren't really friendly to charity workers. The vast majority of people will try to avoid them, ignore them altogether, walk past them, and not really pay much attention to them. So observational data will show a more accurate estimate or indicator of the way people actually respond. One of the limitations, though, of observational research should be jumping out at you at the moment, and that is that sometimes when we observe what people are doing, we don't always know why they're acting in a certain way. So if you look at these bottom two images here, we might say that these two guys are avoiding the charity workers. They're trying to pretend that they're not there, they're ignoring them. In reality, that's our inference of what's going on. We don't know why they're walking in that way. It may be that they were approached by a charity worker earlier on or earlier in the day, or it may be that they know those people and are trying to avoid them. It may be that they don't speak English. We don't know why they're acting in that way. So benefit of observational research is that we observe the actual behavior. Downside of observational research is that we don't always know why that behavior is occurring. So it's up to the researcher to infer why that's occurring, and that can be a real limitation. So that's outlined here in this slide about disadvantages. So the underlying motivations and attitudes can be inferred. That may not always be accurate, so it really depends on the researcher's ability to do that. Another point is that it can take a long time. If you're waiting to observe a behavior that occurs in the naturalistic environment, then you have to wait for that to occur. You might set up something that encourages that to occur, or you might go along to a context where that behavior that you're interested in is more likely to be displayed. But again, you're going to have to wait for that to occur, as opposed to something like a survey where you can go out and ask about a specific behavior that you're interested in. There are also these questions of ethics. If we're observing people in naturalistic settings and we want people to behave in a natural way, then perhaps we don't always want to make it obvious that we're sitting there observing what they do. So that raises questions of ethics, and we'll go into that a little bit later in the lecture about when we should observe people and when we shouldn't observe people. We also have this issue with observation that if people are aware that they're being observed, that can impact on the types of things that they do. Right? So as depicted in the image here, if this guy's interested in the types of food people purchase in a restaurant, then perhaps they're a little bit more conscious about the types of food that they purchase. And you can think about instances where people have been observing you and that's impacted on your behavior. So as I said before, we won't go through the full range of observational techniques, though we allude to a lot of them across the lecture. What I will go through and do is talk about these different ways we can classify observational research. So in terms of being structured, unstructured, disguised, undisguised, direct, indirect, mechanized or human, natural or contrived. And that gives you a good overview of the types of things we can do with these approaches. So to begin with, structured versus unstructured. Structured observation is typically very quantitative. So this is where the researcher goes into the setting with a very clearly defined problem. They know what they're going to observe. They know what that behavior looks like and what an instance of that behavior will be. You could look at this setting here and that might be about a researcher interested in the way people interact with driverless vehicles. the extent to which people might try to take control of that car while it's driving them down the street or whatever. So if they're interested in that, they might count the number of instances someone grabs the steering wheel or grabs the gear stick, and they might say, well, this occurred 10 times. They might exclude instances where someone rests their hand on the steering wheel, for example. It's a very structured setting. It's really quite quantitative. You can compare that with an unstructured form of observation where the researcher enters that setting. They don't necessarily have a clear definition of what they're going to be observing. They're just going to look at what emerges across time and take notes of everything that does go on. So in this depiction here, how does this guy interact with the driverless vehicle as it's moving along the street? We can think about disguised versus undisguised research. And when we think about observation, often we think about disguised research, but we can certainly have undisguised research as well. So undisguised might be where the researcher alerts the potential participants to the fact that they're being observed and then looks to monitor how they go about their behavior. If someone comes into one of my lectures, for example, to observe my teaching style, and this happens regularly, I know who that person is. They're undisguised. They're sitting there taking notes, and the challenge with that, or the difficulty for the researcher with that, is that the people that you're observing can begin to alter their behavior. If I know someone's sitting in my lecture watching the way I'm teaching, perhaps I'm going to put a little bit more effort in, perhaps I'm going to try to interact with students a little bit more than I would naturally. So undisguised can be, it's very upfront, but our research participants can also sometimes alter their behavior. Disguised research is the alternative of that. And that's where the researcher enters that setting and they don't make it clear that they are a researcher or that they're conducting observational research. Participants don't always know that they're part of a study or that their behavior is being observed. The classic example of this is the case with restaurant reviewers or mystery shoppers who go into those settings. They don't make it clear what their goal is, and they simply observe that environment. So a restaurant reviewer enters a restaurant, they order a meal, they might look at the quality of that meal, the service level within that restaurant and stuff like that, and they might write up a report on that. Had they made their presence as a reviewer known to the staff, they might get a meal that's prepared specially for them, with a little bit more effort. They might get a higher level of service quality and so on. So that has the benefit of giving the researcher a bit more real data, if you like. Disguised research runs into problems, however, particularly around sensitive topics where people wouldn't expect that they're being observed. Then they might have some problems or some issues with the fact that someone is monitoring what they're doing and also taking notes about what they're doing to report as part of a research study. So sensitive topics around things like grooming, health habits, anything within a private sort of setting tends to be a little bit more dubious when we talk about disguised research. So when we encounter these sensitive topics, the natural tendency that I see in research students is this idea that we shouldn't investigate them. They're these sensitive areas that we try, or controversial areas that we should try to avoid. They're off limits. That's not always the case. It simply means that we have to do so in an ethical way, in a way that doesn't encroach on people's rights. And often that's in the form of a more creative research design where we employ clever approaches to go about gathering that data that is still respectful of our participants. The case here that I want to talk about a little bit, and I'll put a link in the learning resources section for this module, is the case of Harris Interactive. And they're a research company in the US who every few years, I think it's every 2 or 3 years, conduct research on hand washing behavior across the country. And they do this on behalf of the US Soap and Detergent Association, but also the Society for Microbiology, and to inform public debate and public discussion around the way people wash their hands. Now, what they do is both survey research and also disguised research. When they run their survey research, what they find is that 91% of women and 88% of men say that when they go into a public bathroom or use a public bathroom, they will wash their hands afterwards. Right? So that's about 9 out of 10 people say that they wash their hands when they use a public bathroom. I think that's quite interesting in itself, in that we've got around 10% of people happy to admit that they don't wash their hands, but they're the numbers that we get from self-report. You could think about social desirability playing into those sorts of numbers, where people wouldn't normally want to present themselves as, I guess, dirty or unhygienic, and therefore might overestimate the rate at which they wash their hands. When they run disguised research, however, what they find is that 88% of women actually can be shown to wash their hands, so around the same number, but only 66% of men, so it falls by about a quarter. So that's a big drop for guys who say that they're washing their hands, but when we conduct, or when Harris Interactive conducts their disguised observation, that they show that such a much smaller proportion of men are actually not washing their hands. So it's helps to show the difference between asking outright and using disguised observation. And you can have a read of that research via the link in the learning resources, but essentially what they did to investigate or employ that disguised observation approach was have someone stand in a public bathroom in several locations around several cities in the US, pretend to be someone sitting grooming themselves, and they monitored people coming and going from the bathroom and whether or not they washed their hands. It wasn't done in a way that identified people. Obviously that's a very private setting. People aren't aware that they're being observed. It'd be bad if they were identified in research. So their way of getting around that was not to identify people, but just to have someone casually observe them in that setting. So it's quite an interesting design. And you can think about other ways that you might go about monitoring that sort of behavior as well. For example, the number of soap button presses versus the number of people who go in and out of the bathrooms could be an alternative. So linking into what I was saying before, just because something is a sensitive topic doesn't mean we avoid it. It necessarily means we employ a more clever approach. We've also got direct versus indirect observation. So direct observation is where we record a behavior as it occurs. So we actually observe the true behavior. And then indirect observation is where we observe or look at artifacts that are left behind that indicate that the behavior has taken place. So a good example of that is, as I've got here, we might be interested in the amount of drinking behavior in young people at a music festival, for example. We might be looking for to use direct observation, where we go along to the festival and see how many people are purchasing drinks, how many people are actually drinking. Or we might use an indirect approach where we look at the number of bottles left behind on the ground and in the bins after the festival has taken place. So the number of people falling over and those sorts of things that indicate that they've been drinking. So we can use two very different approaches to measure essentially the same thing. When we look at those indirect observation methods, one of the most common ways to look at that or analyze those settings is what we call a trace analysis. So trace analysis is where we examine traces of a behavior left behind after it's taken place. So this is very commonly used within the print media industry. So you can think about, if you're a newspaper producer or a magazine company, you might be interested in knowing which articles in your magazine or in your newspaper that consumers find most interesting, or that your readers find most interesting. You could ask them outright, or you could use an observational technique. So what trace analysis is where they look at wear and tear on newspapers or dog-eared corners on magazines within doctors' surgeries and on airlines and anywhere where that reading material is located, to work out which articles readers are viewing most, and they're looking at that trace left behind, which is the wear and tear on those magazines. It's also used in design or architecture, where they want to know if there are multiple entrances to a store, for example, which one's most popular, or where the foot traffic goes most. And what they look at is wear and tear on carpet or wear and tear on tiles, as an indicator of where people typically walk or which door they typically enter or exit via. So it's looking at traces of a behavior rather than the actual behavior. A special type of trace analysis that's commonly mentioned in textbooks, but in reality I don't see a lot of it written up in the literature, is what we call trash analysis. Trash analysis is where the researcher looks through someone's garbage to see what sorts of things that they've eaten in the past and the way that they might engage in recycling behavior as opposed to throwing something in the regular bin. So here's a good example where the rubbish is sorted into recyclables versus non-recyclables. So in that recycling sort of context, that's going to be a useful approach. In reality, we don't see a whole lot of this, but it is often discussed. Another area where it's often talked about is in package design. So in looking at the rubbish left behind from someone after they've used a product, whether or not a package has been ripped open or if it's clear that they opened it very easily, you can get at that by looking at what people throw away and the remnants of the package, if you like, that they've tossed. You also saw a good example of this trash analysis in a documentary that was on the ABC quite recently, if you watched that, which was called The War on Waste. And this is where the guy in the documentary essentially went through people's garbage and classified it into recyclable versus non-recyclable versus food scraps and those sorts of things to see if people were throwing out too much and how they might minimize that. Although he didn't call it a trash analysis, I don't think, as the illustration here indicates or displays, the way in which he's sorting that rubbish is really a form of trash analysis. So that's a good illustration of that approach. We've got mechanized versus human observation. So you can imagine in some instances it's quite useful to have a person go along and observe instances of a behavior. People can pick up on minor subtleties or minor instances of the behavior and note those down. The problem with people observing behaviors, though, is that across time people tend to fatigue very quickly and people tend to overlook or miss some instances of behavior because they do get fatigued. So with this illustration here, you can think about someone who's monitoring the types of traffic that goes through an intersection or the types of people in the vehicles going through that intersection. And this is quite familiar to me because I've done studies like this before, which is why I've given that example. And I know very clearly that you can get fatigued quite quickly. That's a good instance where human observation is commonly used, but often there's a little bit of difficulty with that because people fatigue. The alternative, of course, is to have that observation done by machine or automate that in some way, which makes the observation really quite reliable. A lot of those instances are not missed because machines are not going to fatigue. But the problem with a machine doing that observation is that if there's variance or an odd instance of that behavior, sometimes that will be overlooked. So it has to be programmed to pick up everything. So often that's a bit of a trade-off. Now, there are, of course, instances where human observation isn't possible and we do need to automate it or do need to have it done by a computer or by a machine. You can think about web traffic being a good example of that. Obviously, people can't monitor the type of traffic going to certain web pages. If you've ever had a website and had Google Analytics stored on that, that represents a form of mechanized observation. So if you're unfamiliar with that, think about Google Analytics as looking or appearing as a page like the one here on the screen that'll indicate the type of traffic coming to your website. If people are new visitors versus returning visitors, and it does that by using cookies, placing cookies on people's machines, the number of minutes that they spend on your site, the number of minutes they spend on specific pages, which pages they go to, which pages they leave from, the language that's on their browser when they enter your site, the location where they enter from and stuff like that. It can be really quite informative. Obviously a human can't monitor that. We need that to be done with a computer. So that represents a form of observational research as well. A more recent development within this mechanized observation is these fitness trackers that a lot of people are wearing now that will monitor people's things like the number of steps they take throughout a day. It might monitor their blood pressure, the number of hours that they're sleeping, their heart rate, those sorts of things. That's very much a form of mechanized observation that's really quite reliable, and we as people wouldn't be able to be quite as reliable for such a prolonged period of time. So that mechanized observation is really quite becoming quite popular and quite common in that respect. Often we don't think of these as observational research, and anytime they're just generating data, I guess it's just generating data, but when we have that data, we can start to examine it, and therefore it does constitute a form of observation that can be classified as observational research. All right, and finally, we can think about observation as being done in a naturalistic environment versus a contrived environment, and the pros and cons of these are a little bit of a trade-off. So if we're thinking about naturalistic environments, like shopping centres or retail contexts where we're trying to observe how consumers act, that is a situation where we're going to get very naturalistic and very authentic behaviour. The problem with a naturalistic setting, as I mentioned before, though, is that we can often be waiting around a long time for instances of that behaviour to occur. So that can be a positive in the respect that we're getting authentic behaviour, a little bit negative in that we often have to wait a long time for that to occur, or for a number of instances of that to occur. The alternative then is to bring people into laboratory settings, or settings where they're more likely to display that behaviour. So product testing facilities, for example, where people are often brought into those and asked to interact with products, and then they're observed. They're quite good because we place people in settings where they're going to generate or going to display that behaviour, but the difficulty there is that they may not respond or act in an authentic way because they know that they're being observed. They know that they're being asked to display that behaviour. Now, as we've gone through this, some of the issues of ethics are probably cropping up in your mind. So if we're engaging in disguised research, or we're observing people in naturalistic settings, or we're employing some computer to monitor what people do online, questions of ethics are going to crop up. And think about the hand washing example, for instance. If people don't know that they're being observed, then we can start to ask, is that ethical research? We know that for a lot of those topics, things like disguise and having people in a naturalistic setting is very important, or we simply wouldn't see that behaviour. So we can ask, well, how are researchers guided? And thinking back to our lecture on ethics, we can talk about ethics committees within universities where it's academic research. All of our projects go through ethics committees. In the US, in North America, those ethics committees are called institutional review boards, or IRBs. So if you hear that term or see that within research, that's simply referring to ethics committees. Outside of universities, we have industry codes of conduct, and then more broadly, all of us are bound by privacy legislation within the countries that we're in. So therefore, there are these restrictions on what we can do as part of research. Thinking about setting up observational studies, though, 3 key questions can guide researchers. So we can ask, is the behaviour being performed in a public setting where people should normally expect to be observed, or normally expect that other people can see what they're doing, or is it more of a private setting? If it's a private setting, chances are you observing people is going to be a little bit more contentious, a little bit more likely deemed unethical. So the more public it is, the more ethical it's deemed to be. Is the behaviour anonymous? So if people are not identifiable, then there are going to be fewer questions. So as part of in a public setting, if we're observing people and if we're reporting on what people do in that public setting, if we're not identifying those people, often that's seen as a little bit more acceptable. But then overriding all of that is whether or not the person has consented into that study. Right? If a person has consented into being observed in a private setting, and they've consented into them not being anonymous, then clearly that's going to be deemed more acceptable. It has to still go through an ethics process, clearly, but if they've consented into that, then often that research will proceed. So a couple of examples where we can think about observational data that is collected on us, and whether or not these questions that I've said typically should guide researchers, how they play into that. So all of us can think about the way in which people contribute to social media. All of us have experienced that, or at least seen other people contributing to social media. Social media, depending on our privacy settings, and if we're contributing on a public page, is very much a public space. Right? So if people are posting comments on a page that belongs to some brand, such as, say, Nike, right, that's seen as a public setting. The problem, if you think about it ethically, though, is that people will often treat that as a private space and convey personal information or present private opinions. So it can become a bit contentious there. In a lot of that, the information that is on social media, people's names are typically linked to what they've written. If you're reporting in research about what has been said, obviously you wouldn't be talking about who said what, but the issue becomes if you're quoting what people have said, often those quotes are searchable and can link back to specific people online. So researchers have to be a bit mindful there. Consent may or may not have been obtained. A lot of researchers who are looking at social media data will look at very public data. If they're looking at more private data, often they're requested to get consent. Some companies will have in their social media pages, if you have to sign up to them, for example, consent where you opt into being observed. So we need to be a bit mindful of that. One that people don't tend to think of is in terms of being observed in their behavior is these loyalty programs that many of us are part of. So things like Flybuys and Woolworths Everyday Rewards points. When we make a purchase, often those purchases can be very private, so we can say that's a private setting. People's purchases are very identifiable, especially when we scan our cards, but the reason that brands and those businesses such as Wesfarmers, who control Coles and Kmart, for example, the reason that they can collect that data and conduct research on that is that people have consented into those programs, have consented into businesses sharing that data and learning about our purchase behavior and linking that to us and other people within our households, for example. So while that represents observational data and we might see that as a private setting and people are identifiable, we consent into that. So that's why that's deemed somewhat ethical. All right, in this final part of the session, what I want to do is talk a little bit about physiological observation. So I've gone through some different ways we can classify observational research, and that should give you some good insight into ways in which we can set up observational studies. Physiological observation, though, is a special type of observation where we're not necessarily looking at the way people interact within the wider environment, but we're looking at the way their bodies behave physiologically in some way. And researchers are often interested in physiological data because people have lesser ability to control their physiological responses than they do their more behavioral responses. Data can be a little bit difficult to interpret, and I'll go through some of the issues as we go through the techniques with that because it's correlational. So what we see is that when presented with a certain stimulus, such as a product or a magazine, people's physiological responses are quite automatic, so they might appear more interested or their level of arousal might increase, but it's then up to the researcher to interpret what that arousal is. Is that interest? Is that excitement? Is that fear? That can be a bit of a difficulty there, and they can be quite costly. So purchasing some of these instruments can make it quite costly. One of the more common physiological techniques that are being used more and more in marketing is eye tracking. And in the past, this has sort of been used less because people have often needed to be seated in front of a computer and had their head fixed in place as their eyes were monitored to see what they looked at on a page or what they looked at on a website. But now we've got these portable eye tracking devices, or these wearable eye tracking devices that people can fit onto their glasses, a little bit like Google Glass that came out a couple of years ago and then sort of disappeared. But portable eye tracking devices that can sit on people's glasses and monitor what they look at as they move around an environment. So what they look at when they're driving, what they look at as they're walking around a store or in a mall, for example. So that can be really quite useful. While this is just becoming more popular in marketing, there's a lot of different ways in which it's likely to be used in the future. You can think about, at the moment, trying to understand what people view as they move around a supermarket, whether or not they pay attention to prices, whether or not they pay attention to unit prices or nutritional information on packages, whether or not they attend to products on the top shelf versus the bottom shelves. We really don't have a really solid understanding of that. We can walk around and monitor what we think people are looking at, or we can ask people what they're looking at, but eye tracking data will allow us to see that, especially this portable eye tracking data allows us to see that very explicitly. Eye tracking data also provides us a good indication of what people look at when they're presented with a web page. So this depiction here is of a Google search engine results page. And traditionally what was always said about search engine results pages is that people tend to look at the first 3 or 4 search engine results and very rarely scroll down below the first screen. We say below the fold. And what was typically always reported is that people ignore a lot of the banner advertising. In fact, people typically said that they didn't ever tend to remember banner advertising or remember a lot of these sponsored links along the side of a search engine results page. And that might be the experience that you've had in the past as well. With eye tracking data though, what we tend to see is that people do look at the banner ads and they do look at the sponsored links. It's just that they're not recalling it. So this relates to a phenomenon that we call banner blindness. So people appear to be blind to banner advertising. They appear to be blind to those sponsored links. When we use eye tracking data, we can see that people do look at them, but they're simply not remembering them a lot of the time. So it's quite informative, an informative way to use eye tracking data. Product placement is also another interesting one where eye tracking is going to be really quite useful going forward. Product placement is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Brands invest masses of money into this. In reality, though, the research supporting product placement is really limited. We don't actually know a whole lot about how it works or whether or not it's effective. So you can think about product placement you've seen in TV shows or on movies. It's really quite prominent. In music clips, it's quite prominent as well. We don't know about whether or not it's effective. A lot of the recommendations in relation to product placement are things like it's going to be more effective if one of the central characters uses your products or can be seen interacting with your product. You should want your product not to be associated with a scene showing a villain, for example. But our understanding of that is really quite crude and based on intuition or inference made by researchers or data given by research respondents. Eye tracking data allows us or will allow us to gain greater understanding of that by knowing whether or not people are actually attending to those products placed within those clips, and also how that might be impacting their behavior later on. A couple of other physiological techniques are listed here. So we've got the pupillometer. A pupillometer is a little bit like what you might see here in this top image, or what you might have experienced if you've gone along to an optometrist, where you look into this device and what it's doing is monitoring your pupil. The idea is if you're looking at something that you're interested in, so it might be copy for an advertisement or copy for a print publication. If you're interested in that, your pupil should dilate. So the dilation of the pupil indicating that someone is aroused in some way, or someone's attention has been piqued, or they're a little bit more interested in the content. The issue for the researcher, though, is that the researcher has to infer what that arousal or that interest is. Is it that the person is genuinely interested? Is it that they're fearful? Is it that they find what they're looking at humorous? What is that arousal due to? A psychogalvanometer is also just termed a galvanometer, and what this measures is skin conductance, or the way in which our skin is able to conduct electrical current. A depiction of that is in this bottom image here, and that a researcher will place 2 electrodes on the skin, and sometimes this is on the face, so just under the eye, and sometimes it's on the fingers, as you can see here. They're presented with certain images or certain types of stimuli. It might be ad copy in the case of a marketing study or a marketing experiment. And what the researcher is interested in is knowing whether or not the conductivity between those 2 electrodes increases. So the idea being that if we're interested or our arousal increases, our skin warms up and therefore should conduct electrical current a little bit better. But again, it's up to the researcher to infer what that arousal is due to. And finally, 2 more approaches, and these are probably less used in marketing and I think need to be developed a little bit more in psychology before they can truly be used in marketing with a lot of reliability. They tend to be a lot more expensive than something like eye tracking or psychogalvanometers, and that is the EEG approach or an fMRI approach. So EEG being an electroencephalogram, which looks something like this here. If you've ever worn an EEG cap, that might look familiar to you. Those electrodes essentially are making contact with the scalp. People are presented with images or some sort of stimulus, and then what the researcher is interested in is the types of brain activity that's picked up by those electrodes. The issue with an EEG, though, is again the data generated is correlational. So if a part of the brain appears active or a type of activity is generated that indicates humor or indicates surprise, it's up to the researcher to infer what that's in relation to and whether or not that's credible. fMRI stands for functional magnetic resonance imaging. You may have had an MRI before, so let me just go to images. Actually, I'll just go to EEG data, show you what EEG data looks like. So from this top technique listed here, shown here, you might get EEG data that looks something like this. So this is detecting brain activity when someone's presented with a stimulus, and what the researcher is looking for is changes in particular brain activity or brain current that corresponds to the presentation of some stimulus that the person has seen. MRI data or fMRI data comes from someone being placed in an MRI machine that looks something like this, or looks a lot like that. You may have had an MRI yourself if you've ever had a brain scan. And what the researcher is interested in here is understanding which parts of the brain are active when people are presented with an image. A regular MRI, a magnetic resonance imaging study, will essentially look at cross sections of the brain that look like this, whereas an fMRI study, if we go back here, an fMRI study shows which parts of the brain are active as people are engaged in some function. So that activity is detected based on oxygenation levels within the brain, and that oxygenation should represent which parts of the brain are active as people are engaged in some sort of task or some sort of function. So the idea being, if someone views an ad or something like that that should elicit fear, and a part of the brain lights up that's associated with fear, that task has been achieved. Again, the issue with these sorts of studies is that it's correlational. Has the person truly become scared or fearful looking at that, or do they find it humorous if it lights up a part of the brain linked to humor, or is it that they expect that the researcher is looking for humor? Why is that occurring? So when you see data from these sorts of EEG studies or fMRI studies, one thing to keep in mind is that we do need to take it with a grain of salt. A lot of these techniques are still very much developmental in areas like psychology. We're still learning about the brain and its functions in psychology and neuropsychology. To make that jump to marketing is perhaps a little bit of a leap at the moment. We do see neuromarketing developing a little bit, and firms offering neuromarketing services, but we do have to be a little bit cautious about over-interpreting that data. Keep in mind that it is very much correlational data. So the other thing to be aware of with these studies is that they are very expensive, so we don't see a lot of them, especially the MRI or fMRI studies within marketing. It might cost $1,500 or $2,000 for a 1 hour session with one participant in an MRI machine, so there's not a lot of studies to go by. So in the future we might see more, but at the moment they're relatively limited. Other types of observational techniques, just before we finish off, we've got a content analysis. A content analysis is a lot like your thematic analysis for your upcoming interviews, except rather than drawing out themes, what you would be doing is counting instances of something that occurred across a set of media or a set of documents. For example, you might run a content analysis on advertising within magazines to work out what proportion of ads is trying to promote junk food, or you might look at the types of ethnic representations that are in newspapers, or the level of female representation on the covers of entertainment magazines versus news magazines. Observational audits are another form of technique. So this is where the researcher might go into a consumer setting. So it might be someone's home, it might be into someone's school bag or into their handbag, where they're looking at the way in which people are using or interacting with certain products. So how are products stacked in someone's pantry, or how are products placed within someone's handbag, for example. This can inform very directly the way product packaging is developed. So do we have to place handles in certain places? Should we use smaller packages? You can think about tins of tuna or tins of salmon now that come with tapered tapered edges at the bottom to allow them to be stacked more neatly. All of this comes out of audit type research. So this is essentially how people are interacting with products. That's a type of observation. And finally, we can talk about ethnographies. These are probably less commonly used in marketing, but they're an important one to know about. An ethnography is where the researcher is interested in a research setting and they want to learn about it without necessarily impacting too much on it. And what they do is place themselves in that setting as a participant to observe what's going on. So we call it participant observation. That's a form of ethnography. I often think about ethnography, or a good example of ethnography, as where you have a white Westerner who's interested in tribal life in Africa and they go and live in an African tribe for a month or so. And the idea being that they learn a lot about that tribe and that they can talk about different tribal rituals and behaviors that those people engage in. The difficulty, of course, with it is that when a researcher embeds themselves within that setting, that people within that setting start to behave a little bit differently if they're aware that the researcher isn't a natural member of that setting. To sum all of that up, we can think about the pros and cons. So the pros of observational research is that it does overcome those issues with participants lacking insight or an awareness into how they typically behave or have behaved in the past or are likely to behave in the future. Instead of that, we're looking at their actual behaviors. We tend to be able to observe more directly non-verbal behaviors and naturalistic non-verbal behaviors that wouldn't come out necessarily when we're interviewing or surveying someone. And they can be seen as really valid and really quite reliable techniques if they're used in conjunction with other methods such as surveys. Difficulties is that observational studies rely on the researcher's inferences rather than necessarily knowing why people are behaving in a certain way. There are ethical issues such as invasion of privacy if people aren't aware they're being studied and would prefer not to be studied. And there can be issues with the researcher impacting on the research setting if they're sticking out like a sore thumb and people are starting to behave differently. All right, so through this video, what we've covered is observational research and different ways it can be classified, ethics associated with that, and some of those physiological observation techniques that are becoming more common in industry and that we should start to see more of in the literature. The next video will cover survey research.